I'm a bit nervous. I'll have to live up to that expectation. But that's what round does anyway. What I'm going to do today, because I think the brief I got was, of course, environment and all the other linked issues that you just mentioned, Ram. But also, I think you mentioned communication. So I am not a communicator or a communications expert in any way, but I think what you'll see in the presentation I give you is the attempt to actually communicate. So in some sense, it's kind of naturally built in, but I'll also mention a few things that we have faced in trying to communicate the sorts of issues I'll talk about to different kinds of audiences. So I'll bring those up, and then maybe in the discussion, some of you can reflect on that, give ideas. Of course, you'll have questions also.
I will
Ram,
interrupt
one and a
here
half
to
hours, right?
say 1.5 hours, yes, please. You may go over that a little bit if you need to. That's not an issue. If the discussion is especially lively, feel free, and I'm sure it will be. But I should also remark to everyone that Ashish is being extremely modest. Uh, he is he is a communicator, though he doesn't declare himself to be. And not only has he written extensively, he is the spider at the center of many webs, and he is our link to many other things. So he is one of those people who actually conveys information back and forth in the most exemplary manner. So he's really being modest. So I just wanted to say that before I leave it to him.
Thanks, Ram. No more interruptions. You're just making me more and more nervous. Okay, so I'm going to start now, and basically what I'll do is give you a presentation, a slideshow on the sorts of issues that I've been working on. Usually this is in two parts. One part is looking at the problems, and I often do that in much greater detail, but I think with people like you, I don't need to go into that too much, but we'll do about 10-15 minutes of that, and then look at the kinds of alternatives and solutions that that people on the ground are coming up with, and what are the sorts of frameworks of alternative development or alternative well-being that are emerging from the ground. Okay, all right, so let me see if I can, and let me know if you can see it full screen. Is that okay?
Yep.
Great. So Ram, I've also been doodling in the lockdown period, so that's one of my attempts at art.
Everyone see what I mean?
No. So I think, I mean, this is around us all the time. This image of India moving rapidly, having moved rapidly into the 21st century, and then moving rapidly into the 22nd. Very relatively high rates of growth, second highest after China for a long, long time now, except in the last 2-3 years when it's fallen considerably. And if you look at sort of the normal indicators of what is called development, such as the usage of consumption patterns, usage of things like cars, housing, of course, mobile phones, etc., it would seem as if India is doing very well. But we know that there's another side to it. Before I get there, I think it's very important. One of my favorite hobbies is to look at the original meanings of words. And every once in a while, I'm going to uh, explore that with you. So the word development, all of us have, I mean, if this was a physical class, interactive class, I would actually stop here and say, okay, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? But that's a bit more difficult on a online session. The word development is actually not so old. Sometimes when people like me ask questions about development and say, do we really need it? People look at me and say, it's like you're asking whether we need oxygen. Of course, everybody needs development. It's become such a, like a holy cow. But if you really look at the original meaning of the word development, it comes as the opposite of envelopment. Now, most of us, unfortunately, no longer send letters in envelopes, but some of us used to when we were younger. Maybe some of us still do. So to envelop was to enclose. So development actually meant opening up of opportunities for us as human beings in multiple forms. Of course, the physical, material needs of life, but also much more than that, the cultural, intellectual, spiritual, social, etc. And unfortunately, in the last few decades, basically that has got narrowed down to look at development and material growth, and that also mostly financial. And so if you look at the entire spectrum of so-called undeveloped countries, developing countries, developed countries, etc., there's just a single indicator that's used, which is GDP. Sometimes with the UN Human Development Index, you go a bit further and look at per capita income and a few other things like that. But basically, it's really about economic growth. And everybody, except all countries except probably Bhutan, are oriented towards saying, how do we increase our economic growth? Even now, in the midst of a pandemic, the biggest discussions that are happening is how do we rebuild economic growth? And I think it's very important to question things like this, because none of these are given to us as ultimate truths. They emerge from a certain socio-political economic context. In this case, for instance, the ideology of development emerged post World War II, when Europe and America needed to rebuild their economies. And what better way to do that? No longer with military conquest and colonization, but what better way to do that but to convince the whole world that their model of economic growth was in fact what the whole world needed, and they were developed and we were developing or underdeveloped, and so therefore we needed to go in that same direction. We can go further into this later if anybody's interested in this history of development. But so the other side of the picture is what has development done to environment and to people, especially those most reliant or most dependent on nature and natural resources, but also well beyond that, as I'll explain. And this has essentially meant violence in one way or the other. This is a advertisement from about 30 years back. Probably no ad agency now would repeat an ad like this because they would know it's politically inappropriate. But the notion of development is still exactly the same. As the ad says, all over the world, nature's mighty barriers separate gas, minerals, and water from their destination. Now, just think of it, nature as a barrier, not nature as something that gives us all life, but nature as something that has to be moved aside if we want to develop, if we want to progress, if we want to, in some senses, be more human. And so ripping through jungles in Indonesia, moving the earth in India, laying pipelines. In this case, it's pipelines, it could be dams, it could be mining, it could be ports, it could be any such thing. If nature is in the way, move it aside. And if there are people living in that or dependent on that, move them also aside. So it's actually also enormous violence against communities. I'll show you in a minute a statistic of how many people have been physically displaced because of development projects. So we know now that this model of development, or the kind of growth that we've had in the last few decades, is leading to not just local but planetary level disruptions of various kinds. Climate, of course, is the one that's most spoken about, but there's also biodiversity loss, there's pollution, there's many different things. There's all kinds of different planetary boundaries which scientists agree that we can't cross. If we cross, it's going to rebound on us, which in fact are being crossed. And already human activities are at what is called 1.5 the earth, which means whatever the earth can replenish and give us, we're already using 1.5 times that. Now, any of us who has a bank account would know that if we eat 1.5 times into our capital, eventually we're going to be left with no money at all in the bank. That's exactly what's happening with nature and natural resources in across the planet. Climate crisis is not in the future, it's already at our doorstep. We're already facing the consequences of that. We've seen, for instance, this year and last year, enormous numbers of wildfires, of floods, of droughts, of cyclones, of hurricanes, of strange rainfall patterns, etc., all across the globe. And that is at least partly a result of the kind of impacts we're having on the climate. It's the same with India. There was a study that was done 10, 12 years back, which showed that we are in India already using twice our biological capacity. And that's obviously going to have serious impacts. Some more, for those of you who are fond of statistics, some more statistics on the kind of devastation of the environment that we've seen in the last few decades. And I think it's very well worth pointing out repeatedly, even though we know it, it's really worth repeating and emphasizing that this kind of loss to the environment is, of course, a huge loss to wildlife and biodiversity, but it is also a direct impact on the livelihoods and the survival of hundreds of millions of people. This is sometimes forgotten because in our sort of modernizing economy and our modernizing worldviews, we tend to think of only those who are in IT and those who are in government and those who are in universities and those who are in media. But in fact, 600, 700 million people in India are still directly dependent on forests, on land, on water, on biodiversity for their livelihoods. And so when that is destroyed, there's a direct impact. Now, sometimes it's argued that, yeah, it's fine, there is environmental damage, but then all across the world, if countries have to develop, we have to go in that direction. Then eventually we'll become rich enough or wealthy enough to be able to put back into protecting the environment, as supposedly the wealthier countries of the world today do. And so that is necessary to move people out of poverty and to provide employment. Okay? So a colleague and I did a book in 2012, which looked at this in great detail as to, in this form of economy, are jobs actually being created? And if so, what kind? Is poverty actually being removed? And if so, to what level? And what we found was that since 1991, which is when India moved into this economic globalization phase, much greater investments in the private sector, and so on, there's been net virtually zero new employment in the formal sector, which is the IT, the government, most of the sort of formal businesses, universities, etc. 90+% of the jobs that are in India are today in the so-called informal sector, which is where investments are hardly given. And those are the ones most affected, most badly affected by the pandemic, because they really have no security in terms of livelihoods or other kinds of economic security to back them up. If you think of poverty in terms of not just this silly World Bank figure of $1.50 a day, if you're earning $1.50 a day, you're not poor. Or Montek Singh Ahluwalia, when he was chairman of the Planning Commission, the then Planning Commission, when he said, if you're earning 38 rupees a day in a city, you're not, you're not rich, you're not poor anymore. Now, you have those kind of ridiculous figures. But if you think of poverty in terms of deprivation from basic needs, adequate nutritious food, clean water to drink, clean air, adequate housing, clothing, energy, health and education, just the basic needs, right? According to us and our analysis, at least 70% of India is still poor. And in fact, there are a huge number of people who are newly impoverished, which are the people who are relatively independent and self-reliant in their forests or next to rivers or next to the sea, but have been physically displaced by development projects and are now having to scrounge around for a livelihood. And all of this has become much worse in the lockdown period, with these hundreds of millions of people very badly affected. I'll come back to the COVID issue a bit later. So where is all the money going? If India has had 5, 6, 8% growth rates in the last 30 years on average, obviously there is a lot of new wealth that's being created. And again, we see in India what is actually a global phenomenon: growing inequality between the rich and the poor. The gap is increasing more and more rapidly and very visibly over at least the last 15, 20 years. So that now 5% of India, which probably includes many of us in this call, earn as much as the rest of the 95%. And so that the world's largest single family house can be in a city in which 45% of the population don't have adequate housing. I think you all probably know whose house that is, or who's in that cartoon. Ram, by the way, we also started a series of cartoons with a cartoonist in Bangalore. And one of the interesting things to look at, I actually just had in fact, 2 days back, had a session with a media school, is how much does the media, so one, we have the whole issue of the government neglecting these issues, or not just neglecting, but actually in a negative trend, but also, and corporations, but also how much does the media, the so-called independent media, actually think about or cover these issues. Now, this was a study done in 2011, and I don't think the situation has changed significantly. The 3 highest circulation English and Hindi dailies, their coverage of rural issues was just 2%. just 2%. And even in that 2%, about 20 to 30% was about things like violence and so on, not really truly rural issues in some sense. So, that has probably changed a little bit in the recent past because there's been a lot of farmers' agitations and things like that. But by and large, this is still the picture. So a huge section of India's population is actually just now hidden. It's forgotten. There's a sort of collective amnesia with regard to these people. Um, Now, but it's not just them. It's all of us who, in some sense or the other, are affected. Whether it's pollution in our cities, or it's the kind of jobs that we have. So what's been happening in the process of the last few decades of so-called development is a move away from livelihoods, which were occupations that were within certain cultural, ecological, social context, in which all of this was kind of integrated, to what is now jobs, which we do 9 to 5 and Monday to Friday, and then we wait desperately for the weekend to enjoy ourselves. So we've neatly separated work and leisure, work and pleasure, work and enjoyment. And which is the case because for most people in the modern sector, especially in things like the IT industry, for instance, it's a very mechanical task that they're doing. There's very little job satisfaction. There's very little creativity that gets built into it. And so I call that a whole process of moving from livelihoods to deadlihoods, both in the traditional sectors and in the modern sector. I might have depressed you enough, but if I haven't depressed you enough, you can take a look at this book, which is the one that I mentioned, published in 2012. It has 300 pages of analysis of things that have gone wrong with economic globalization and development in India. It also has 100 pages on alternatives, and that's what I want to turn to now, because since then, that's been my main focus of work. Sorry, one last point that I want to make here, which is about COVID. Now, we've seen in these last 7-8 months of the COVID pandemic and various stages of lockdown and opening up and so on, two broad trends. One is a trend within most governments and corporations of how to make use of this pandemic to become even more powerful and more rich. Governments have become authoritarian. They've used this as an excuse to do more surveillance of citizens, crack down on citizens' organizations, etc. And corporations have used it as a means by which to become richer, as you can see in the figure up on that on the slide there. But there's also the counter trend, which is more and more people asking more fundamental questions about, is there something fundamentally wrong in a system in which, when something like the pandemic hits, hundreds of millions of people are laid off, we can't do all kinds of things that we normally are used to, and we're scared that even if we're sitting at home, we might get affected by this virus. And people have actually been able to express this in terms of also acts of solidarity, acts of resistance, acts of saying, yes, no, I will go out and I will help elderly people in my colony who can't go out to shop, or I will build community resilience and strength in such a way that in fact we're able to get over this crisis with minimum impact. And those are some of the examples that I also want to give you. So we have this choice right now of going in that so-called normal direction of more authoritarianism, more profit making, more unsustainability, more exploitation, etc. Or we have the choice of moving towards a greater solidarity based, working with each other, community based thing, which is much more sustainable. And so I want to give a number of examples of the second part. And what's interesting, I think, is that many governments have also realized that we can't do business as usual. At least they realize that their rhetoric needs to change. And that's what we see in India. So when in May and June, the Prime Minister announced these Atmanirbhar Bharat package, self-reliant India package, it sounded like all of us to say, oh, wow, there's a sudden sort of change in mentality and heart. And because he spoke about how from village to nation, we need to become self-reliant. But if you see the actual package that was produced under Atmanirbhar Bharat, it's actually just some nice window dressing, but it's in fact even moving the economy even more towards commercialization, big corporate players, and not really moving towards self-reliance of local communities and villages, as was mentioned. And I will talk about that again. So the big question that arises is, are there alternatives? And I would say that yes, there are alternatives, but there are two kinds. And it's very important for us to understand that these alternatives need to be basic and fundamental, which means that they have to go beyond just saying, okay, we're producing waste, let's recycle it. Okay, we're producing carbon, let's capture it somewhere else and do carbon trading. Those, to my mind, are very superficial solutions because they don't go to the root of the problem. So one kind of alternative or response is to ask fundamental questions and to resist the structures and relationships of oppression. I heard somebody mentioning caste just as I entered the room. Caste, Adivasis, gender, all these sorts of issues. Unless we can actually understand how the problems we're talking about are created by these structures of oppression and inequality and marginalization and unsustainability, and challenge them in various ways, including through resisting those forces, we will be just tinkering around a little bit here and there with the system. So movements of resistance become very important. I love this image, by the way. This is a photograph that I was lucky and honored to be able to be part of this movement 30 years back against two mega hydro projects in central India. This is the Indravati River. And there the Adivasis were saying, and just think of this as a sort of, and to me it was mind-blowing, that they were telling the government, they were saying, we're opposing these dams not only because we will lose our livelihoods and will be displaced, but even more so because for us this river is sacred, it's our mother. We will not allow it to be shackled and bound by your dams. Now, it's a very different way of thinking. It's a different worldview. It's a worldview which celebrates life, which thinks of life and nature as being worthy of respect, of being spiritual. Compared to an engineer who's going to look at that and salivate and say, oh, wow, 300 megawatts of power. Never mind what happens to the forests and the wildlife and the people in that area. And I think, therefore, these acts of resistance become very powerful forms of advocacy, communication, and challenging the fundamental visions of modernized development that we have otherwise been given. We've seen these kinds of movements over the last few decades, from the Chipko movement in the 1960s and 70s to save Himalayan forests. And I remember when I'd gone there at that time as a very young school and college student, one of the things I was most struck by was their communication methods. There was no internet, no social media, no nothing then. But folk singing, for instance, there was a folk singer called Saklani ji, and he adopted a lot of the old folk songs to give them environmental messages or social justice messages. And that was so popular. We were going village to village and singing those things. And this movement became really strong and, in fact, quite successful in protecting forests, at least in a part of the Himalaya. The picture you see at the bottom right-hand side is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, a much more recent version of the same kind of resistance, peaceful resistance movement, again trying to use all kinds of physical and other means to do that resistance and to communicate it. But the second kind of, so that's one kind of alternative, which is the sort of responses of resistance and so on. The second kind of alternative, which is equally important or even more so, I think, is constructive alternatives. Because people do have deprivations, people do have needs. There are aspirations and needs that need to be met. And so how does one do it in a proactive and constructive manner? So over the last few years, we've been documenting hundreds of examples across the country, and now increasingly with other networks across the world, of these sorts of what I call radical alternatives on the ground. I'm going to run through a few of them very quickly. There's much more material available on a website that I'll show you later, in case any of you want to dig deeper into any of these. For me, one of the most inspiring is DDS, Deccan Development Society. This is about 5,000 Dalit and Adivasi women farmers. Since somebody mentioned caste, I think this is very important. Now, as Dalit women, they are doubly oppressed as in casteist society and because of patriarchy. And 30 years back, till about 30 years back, they faced all the kinds of marginalizations, deprivations, lack of adequate food, lack of education, health, etc. What they did over the last 30 years have been to collectivize themselves into women's sanghas, committees, in about 75 villages, bring back their traditional varieties of seeds, switch completely to organic farming, collectivize a lot of their farming operations, share knowledge and seeds and so on with each other, claim land rights for the women, which is very unusual, create grain banks in every village, and through this and many other ways, create what they call not just food security for themselves, but food sovereignty. And this is a very important distinction. Food security is where I have enough food, but it might be given to me by the government or I buy it from the market or whatever. Food sovereignty is where I have complete control over everything to do with the production of food, the land, the water, the seeds, the knowledge, etc. And that's what they move towards. They've actually moved well beyond that into also forming their own, Ram knows this well, forming their own community radios. I think the country's first community radio station, their own filmmaking unit, they ran their own school for about 10, 12 years, and many other things. So through all of this, transforming their lives as Dalits and women in very remarkable and significant ways. And the same women who were facing hunger 3 decades back are today feeding municipal health workers, police workers, etc., in the nearby town of Zahirabad during the COVID epidemic. And they're providing to the district relief funds from their own farms. Similar story in Northeast of a women's network called Northeast Network, which has been working with farmers, especially women farmers in Nagaland and other parts of the Northeast, where again during COVID period, they saw that the maximum resilience was in those communities where they had established their own control over food, or they had sustained their traditional methods of cultivation. They had no problems with food. And what the Northeast Network also did was to enable them to make sure that they could continue selling in places, in cities like Kohima, with all the safety precautions and so on during the COVID period. So they had much less of a livelihood impact than in many other parts of the country. A third example is a women's network in Uttarakhand called Mati. This began as a movement to deal with domestic violence against women and girls, but moved very quickly also into looking at independent economic livelihood options for the women. And they did two things. One was the traditional modes of livelihood, like making products out of wool, which they had traditional skills, but then also doing um, moving into the modern sector of tourism. So doing home-based ecotourism, or homestays as they call them, which is very interesting, not just because it is a source of revenue for the local people, but also because it switches the entire tourist mindset and hierarchy. So the tourist is no longer on top with the local community at the bottom, trying just being a service provider. There's an equal relationship that gets built. The tourist is not just tourist, but is a visitor who's in fact eating exactly what the family is eating, who's looking at the nature and village life around through the eyes of the local community, where in fact a number of them have also got trained in doing this kind of nature and culture guiding. And it becomes actually a relationship that lasts much longer than just a tourist going to a hotel and coming back. Move to Kachch, which is another very favorite part of my life over the last many years, because it's an area that's badly neglected. Very few people know about it, but some incredible innovations are coming out of this. So one of them is to do with crafts. As we know, in India, handicrafts and especially handlooms have sort of declined very sharply because of mass industrial production, and the kind of government policies which really don't provide adequate safety for handicrafts and handlooms. In fact, recently the government abolished the handloom board and the handicrafts board. Um, Here in Kachch, what has happened is that because of the intervention of some of the innovative wankers, the handloom weavers, and an organization called Khamir, they have managed to bring back handloom weaving through the use of local organic cotton called Kala cotton and new products, but still maintaining the Kachchi identity and the Kachchi chhap, the brand, right? The particular weave that they have, the double weave. And because of that, a lot of young people are either staying on or have come back, including young people who had moved off to the Gulf or moved to Adani and Tata's factories and all, have actually come back into handloom weaving. And we did a 2-year study with them. And when we asked them, why are they coming back? Is it just because of the money that's there? And they said, look, yeah, money is an issue. I mean, livelihoods obviously is an issue. We have a secure livelihood now with handlooms, which we didn't have earlier. But it's not as if we're earning necessarily any better than we were earning with the Tatas and the Adanis and so on. But now we are with our family. We have complete control over our time. We don't have a boss sitting on our head. We are proud of our own heritage and being able to continue it. And we are able to express our creativity in ways that was impossible in a factory. And in fact, young women who never used to sit traditionally on the loom and create things are now doing that, like Sheetal Ben here in the picture. So there's multiple transformations again that you can see here. Again, from Kachchh, a very interesting story of a village called Kunariya, which had already built up its panchayat system, sort of energized its panchayat system over the last few years. So when COVID hit, they immediately swung into action and did everything that the government was trying to do elsewhere, but they did it themselves and very differently. Of course, all the safety measures, the masks, the physical distance, all of that, but at the same time saying that our economic activities won't stop. We will continue. For instance, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was continued for about 100 workers through this whole period, of course, ensuring safety and security and so on. And now what's interesting is that Suresh Changa, who you see at the bottom there, when we had a webinar with him recently, he was saying, we did a study in this period which showed that we're spending 40 lakh rupees every month on household items, soap, footwear, detergents, etc., etc. Why can't we produce all of this ourselves? Why do we have to give all this money to corporations who fleece us anyway? And so, in fact, in a number of communities, this thought process is beginning, and I'll come back to that later, about how does one make economies much more self-reliant, not just with food, but with other basic needs also, and reduce one's dependence um, on corporations and the government. And in fact, some groups like Kudumbashree, which is a state-supported move in Kerala with some 50 lakh women involved, is in fact precisely trying to do this, provide or enable women in every village, wherever they are, not to have to go to cities to work, but to be able to get dignified livelihoods wherever they are. And in fact, in COVID, because these units, Kudumbashree units, were already empowered and energized, they were the most important reason, one of the most important reasons why Kerala managed to deal with COVID much better than other states in the country, because in every village they had that facility and mobilization. So now, putting all of this together, if you look at rural India, and I'll come to urban India in a minute, if you look at rural India, this whole myth that villages will inevitably be poor, will be bad places to live, will be extremely casteist, will be patriarchal, etc., all of which has been true and is still true for a large part of India, but it's not inevitable. It's not something that has to be. In fact, we've seen village revitalization where it has taken place in many of these places where, in fact, these fundamental structures of oppression and unsustainability and economic insecurity have been dealt with. And there is, in fact, also been reverse migration where people are going back. So much greater attempts at trying to create self-reliance, which has also meant better um, resilience during the COVID period. Now, of course, even if there's significant reverse migration, we will still have cities. We'll still probably have 40, 50, 60% of India living in cities eventually. So we need to think about what happens in cities also. What are the alternatives available? And again, going back to Kachchh, this is, of course, not a big city. It's a small town, 200,000, 250,000 people. But what's happening there, I think, has got very important lessons for urban areas everywhere. 3 or 4 of the poorest colonies, the so-called slum colonies, have been enabled by 5 local civil society organizations to uh, empower themselves with the knowledge of what rights they have, what kind of powers they can exercise, how they can make the civic administration accountable, but also how they can do a lot of things for themselves: housing, water, energy, and things like that. So planning their own colonies, making them much more livable, making them much more dignified, and enabling things like water self-reliance, and also empowering women and girls to be part of the decision-making process and to create more safe urban spaces. So this is a very interesting exercise. If you look it up, called Homes in the City, you'll find a lot of information on that. Sometimes middle classes like us are sort of get off our lazy armchair existence and also do things. And there are lots of very interesting examples of that. In Bangalore, for instance, lake revival has been remarkable. That what you see there on the picture is Kaikondrahalli, which was completely drained out and garbage was being dumped into it. And then the surrounding colonies, residents, they actually mobilized over 5 years, 6 years, and regenerated the lake so that now it's got wildlife. It's a great place for enjoying, for walking, for cycling, etc. And interestingly enough, they also tried to figure out how poor people who are dependent on the lake for fodder and fishing could continue their livelihood activities. So it didn't become like this divide between the rich and the poor, which often happens in environmental movements, unfortunately. And there's many other such examples. There's zero waste very close to my house. Fortunately for me, now there's a zero waste retail shop, which means what I used to be able to do when I was young, which is go to a shop and buy things without any plastic packaging, I can again do now. Unfortunately, it's expensive. So there is a class divide there, which still has to be looked at. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of these sorts of things happening also in cities, which are worth looking at. We have recently put together and are putting together multiple volumes of these stories of community resilience during COVID times with food, livelihoods, health, and so on. So I can put the link on the chat box later when I finish for you to see for you to be able to see these. And again, the attempt is to try and create different ways by which to communicate these stories, because as I'll say later, to me, the most important thing for communication is how to tell a story, how to make it interesting, because that's what sticks in people's heads and hearts. So, in fact, one of these volumes has also become a graphic novel by a cartoonist from Bangalore. A last couple of things before I move into looking at the framework of transformation, of examples. To me, underlying all of this is how do we look at our education system, because we all get taught in a certain way and that stays with us through life, whether it's in our homes or it's in schools and colleges. And unfortunately, most educational institutions are places where we learn competition, where we learn individualism and selfishness, where we learn that the most important things in life are to become rich and famous and powerful. I must come first. It doesn't matter what happens to the rest of my classmates, etc. So these are alternative institutions which try and do things very differently, create learning spaces that are fun, that are enjoyable, where a child's curiosity is encouraged, a child's internal innate sort of creativity is encouraged, and where a sense of responsibility, so rights, yes, but also a sense of responsibility toward other people. So you have much less competitiveness and so on in these institutions. Some other time we can go into these in detail. There are case studies and stories of all of these available on our website. I won't go into them. Just to mention again, in terms of my favorite hobby of looking at the origins of words, the original meaning of the word school is from Greek called schole, and it meant leisure. Now, most schools in India are prisons, but that's what the original meaning was. And these are alternative institutions that are actually trying to bring that back, create learning, create enjoyable learning experiences and places. With technology also, you see that just like education has been captured by a certain system, either government or corporate system, and we get sort of created in a ways that easily fit into that system. It's the same with technology, that we've always started, especially in the last few decades, we've thought of technology development as those that are happening in the formal big institutions of government and corporations. Whereas in fact, technological innovations are happening all the time by so-called ordinary people. And those are the ones that are the most useful for people and often also the most ecologically sensitive. So we're seeing that happening, the sort of democratization of technology also happening in some alternative spaces, such as, for instance, with architecture. Um, just to give you one example quickly, the bottom left-hand side is the building of SecMol, which is an alternative learning institution in Ladakh. If any of you has seen, probably most of you would have seen Three Idiots, the film. The character there that Amir Khan plays is actually partly based on the guy who set this up, Sonam Wangchuk. And in the making of that building, firstly, all the students and the faculty were involved in actually doing construction. But even equally important, what they've used is passive solar technology, so that even in the middle of winter, when it's minus 20 degrees outside, inside the building, there is no need for any artificial heating. Now, I don't know, Ram, you're sitting in Delhi now. Is it cold and are you using a heater or not? But most buildings in Delhi are made in such a way that you'd have to use an air conditioner or you'd have to use a heater. And these are examples. The complete opposite of that is the top right-hand side picture, which is the building of the office of Hunarshala, which when it's 42, 43 degrees outside, you can sit inside with just a fan, sometimes even without a fan, no need for air conditioning. So it's really about, how does one rethink technology? And the same thing with media and communications. How do you sort of rethink it? How do you take it back from the capture of governments and capture by governments and corporations and the mindsets that go with it, to say media, communication, arts, architecture, technology, knowledge, all of this needs to be in the democratic space. It's all of us who are part of creating it, part of generating it, part of sustaining it, part of passing it down through generations. It's not only in these formal institutions where this happens. So there's many examples of alternative media also. Ram is more familiar with them than I am, but for instance, with community radio stations, very interesting mobile-based platforms in Chhattisgarh and elsewhere. There's things like CG Netswara, Gramwani, where into a much larger space. And if you're all going to get into communications, to me, this becomes very important. How do you sustain and create and generate those sorts of spaces in which our truths can also be put out there, not just what corporations and the government wants to think of us. But doing all of this, insofar as the government still exists, we also need to also then think about how do we make the government accountable. And so where you have movements of people who are both showing what's possible on the ground and creating an adequate sort of level of advocacy and pressure, then of course we also get somewhat progressive laws, policies, and schemes every once in a while. It's uncommon, but it does happen. So whether it's the Right to Information Act, which I think is the most revolutionary law in India since independence, the Forest Rights Act, which has enabled a lot of communities to take back control in their lives, forest-based communities, or schemes for organic farming, renewable energy, etc. They all show that it is possible to create spaces even within the existing system, even as we fight for changing that system. Now, there are hundreds of examples, thousands of examples around the world of similar kind of radical alternative movements and resistance movements. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into them. I'll show you the cover of a book later on where there are more than 100 examples of these that we've documented. But, oh, sorry, I forgot. I love this map, by the way, again, as a communication tool. Whenever I put this up, mostly people say, ye ulta kyun hai? Why is it upside down? And we get into a little conversation about how a lot of things that we think are normal are actually products of colonial times. And our minds have been brainwashed into thinking that it's normal for Europe to be on top. And it's normal for Europe to be actually much larger than it, to look much larger on a map than it actually is. This is the actual sizes of the continents. You can see how big Africa is and how small Europe is. And England, which ruled half the world, disappears in this map. So it's a nice decolonizing mind. It's a great thing to also talk about and use as communication. But the other reason is for me to just put up some terms of movements in different parts of the world, which as I said, are available in that book, which I'll show you. Just to give you two or three examples quickly. to me, this one is very, very inspiring because it's in the middle of the most war-torn area of the world, the Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey area in between those, the border areas, where the Kurdish ethnic community has been trying to create its own autonomously governed region, but based on eco-feminist principles and based on the principles of living in peace with each other and the earth, and not just with Kurds, but also a number of other ethnic communities there, and living with direct democracy, talking about how people on the ground are the ones who need to be taking decisions, not governments and bureaucrats and so on. There's a lot available on the web on this movement. Please look it up. Quickly, three examples from Europe. Most of them run or in which young people are involved. So on the bottom left-hand side is an example of what's called alternative currency, where people are saying, why should our lives be so dominated by the euro or the rupee or the dollar? Why can't we have localized exchanges using our own medium of currency? So they've created something called Beki, and 5 communities actually exchange a lot of products and services just using that particular currency, which enables a independence, but also it stimulates the local economy in ways that centralized money systems don't. The one on the top right hand side is somewhat similar, but using not money as a currency, but using time as a currency, where this school is run with very high quality teaching, but with very low fees. How? Because at least a part of the administration and the teaching is done free of cost by parents of the children. And what's happened is that whole community has said, okay, I'm going to put my X amount of hours into a roster, which is freely available to anybody in the community. I could be good at physics, I can teach in the school. I'm a good electrician, I can do free electrical repairs to anybody in the neighborhood, etc. I'm good at yoga, I can give you 5 hours of free yoga session. So when you do that and you pool it together, you find that 300, 400, 500, 5,000 people can actually get the same products and services with much less money because they don't have to pay for them. And it works out as mutually beneficial for people. Actually, traditionally, we used to do that anyway. No, I mean, we would land up at each other's farms or whatever, house reconstruction without asking for money. But unfortunately, commercialization has changed all of that. The top left-hand side is a non-profit cafe, and there's lots of them across Europe where young people are saying, yes, we want to do economic business. Yes, we want to get revenues for the investments we make, but we're not into capitalist profit making. And we want to enjoy ourselves. So let's create a space. And we want to also be socially just. So let's create a space in which so-called disabled people, refugees are the ones who actually can work without fear. I'm going to go quickly now because we're running out of time. So now putting these sorts of examples and many others together, what's the kind of sort of frameworks or visions of an alternative world that are emerging? So in the book, the same book that I mentioned, Asim and I called it Radical Ecological Democracy. And since then, we've been writing about it in different ways and talking about it, which is a very simple idea. Oh, incidentally, going back to the word origins, the word radical is so badly misused these days. You know, we say radicalized youth, which means people who are killing each other, or radicalized religion. Actually, radical means going to the roots. So if you were radically religious, it would be great because you would talk about compassion and love and solidarity and so on. Most religions have that kind of spiritual ethics as their fundamental basis. But anyway, so that's how I'm meaning radical, as going to one's roots as a human being, or as in our cultural and ecological ways. So the idea is very simple. The meaning of Swaraj is autonomy, freedom, um, as an individual, as a community, but in responsibility to everybody else's autonomy and freedom also. This is very, very important. It's not just that I have the right to do what I want, like an American would say, but it's about I have the right to do what I want, and as a community, we have the right to do what we want, and we want to be free and autonomous, but we will only do it insofar as it doesn't undermine your ability also to be autonomous, free, dignified, etc. So that's the basic idea of Eco-swaraj or radical ecological democracy. Each one of us is part of decision making, but when we're part of decision making, we're responsible to other people and to the rest of the earth, to other species. So there's 5 spheres of this which we can think of. The top right hand side is the politics part, which is that democracy is actually not so much about my going to vote once in 5 years and then hoping that for the next 4 years and 99 whatever 364 days the government will do the right thing for me, but actually it's more about saying that wherever I am part of decision making. For some reason, one example I wanted to give is gone missing here, but it's an example from central India, and it's kind of similar to the Kurdish movement, which is uh, 90 villages which have got together as a federation and have declared that even as we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, in our area, we are the government. That is what democracy is. It's power of the people. It's not power of those we elect. So that's radical democracy. And part of that is also looking at other things, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Economic democracy is what, for instance, the Dalit women farmers of DDS are saying, that when it comes to food or land or seeds, the means of production must be in our control. They can't be controlled by a corporate body or by the government. And this would then include land, forests, machinery, tools, anything that you're using as a means of production has to be in the control of the producers. This is not state socialism. This is not capitalism. This is really people, communities taking control back over the economy. But that also then means that the economy is about much more localized exchange, much more acts of caring and sharing. Now, as we know, in our formal economy, the role of women in giving care is completely invisibilized. So this becomes again a central part of this kind of alternative economy. The third part of this very important, we keep talking about things like casteism and patriarchy and so on, is struggles for social justice. Because if we don't also do that, we could end up with something like the Kachchh Panchayat in Haryana, which is extremely patriarchal and casteist. So they say, yeah, local democracy, local economic control, etc., but extremely unjust in many different ways. So that has to be part of the struggles. The fourth sphere on the bottom left-hand side is of culture and knowledge. This is really important for all of us, especially if you're into communications and so on, where we kind of assert the fact that cultural diversity and knowledge diversity and the knowledges that are being created and sustained are in the commons. They're not privatized. They're, the arts and etc. is all part of the commons. So just to, oh, here it is. This is the slide that I was going to show you. So these are the 90 villages that have kind of declared based on a very famous slogan from one village from 30 years back, Mendha Lekha, which said, in our village, we are the government. Nobody else will take decisions with regard to what happens in our village. And you build up a model of democracy based on that kind of radical decision making from the ground up to larger and larger scales. And when you look at the larger scales, which is what these 90 villages, for instance, are doing, you start thinking of political decision making not in the current boundaries that we have, but in terms of ecological units and cultural units. It's a very interesting way of thinking about it. So for instance, if you look at South Asia, instead of thinking of South Asia as being cut in the current nation states, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and then you can extend it to East Asia, including China, Bhutan, Myanmar, etc. But if you start thinking about it, you say that how would it be if we were actually governing these from an ecological and cultural perspective? It would then mean that the fence between Tibet and Ladakh is broken down, and people who used to be able to migrate back and forth and wildlife that used to be able to migrate back and forth are able to do it again, and it's governed by those communities in a way that creates peace. The same, say, in the Siachen area between India and Pakistan, or in the Sundarbans area between India and Bangladesh, that you actually start creating these zones of ecological peace, locally governed, and you start tearing down the nation state boundaries, which are creating such huge problems in terms of conflicts and ecological devastation and so on. Culture and knowledge, I've already mentioned, democratization of knowledge, the assertion that cultural diversity is important. You can't have one religion sort of bearing down on all others, as is happening in India right now and has happened in the past in and many other countries in Pakistan and so on. So, sustaining the kind of diversity of ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of believing, ways of doing, ways of dreaming becomes very much a part of this alternative movement. And rethinking our relationship within nature. So, how do you kind of uh, think again that we are, as human beings, are part of nature? We're not separate from it. And how do we think of the rest of nature also from a perspective of respect? In many countries now, including in India, there's movements towards accepting the right, recognizing the rights of rivers, the rights of other species. It's a very interesting phenomenon that's taking place. So last slide here, and then I'll end with looking at some issues of communications, is that all these sorts of examples that I'm talking about, the most fundamental part of them, which I think is important for us to learn, is not about how do you replicate a Deccan Development Society somewhere else, etc., or how do you upscale. I think those are the wrong questions to ask. But how do you learn the sort of lessons, the principles, the ethics, the values that emerge from these, and then how do you apply them in your own context? And so to me, this actually is the most important slide. That, for instance, if you take the fourth bullet point, the basic ethic, the principle used in all these transformations is moving away from competitiveness and selfishness to collaboration, cooperation, and the commons. Which doesn't mean I erase my identity, not at all, but that I am part of a collective, and I'm responsible to it. And many others that are on this list. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion later. So a process that Ram and I have been involved in the last few years is attempting to actually try and bring together a lot of these different movements and ideas and concepts together, to learn from each other, to share, to collaborate more, to do collective visioning, collective dreaming, and advocacy for enabling these changes. It's called Vikalp Sangam. That's the website, which has now, I think, about 1,500 stories of the kind that I've just showed you. These are 3 recent publications, which also have a lot of case studies and visions of what India could look like. The one in the middle is the global book with 100 examples from different parts of the world. I can put up in the chat later. All of these are available for free PDF download from our website, so you don't have to pay through your nose for them. I'm moving this, just going straight into this. Just some challenges that we have as communicators. How do we? Okay, I think this is the wrong slide here. Okay, anyway, how do we sort of not take shortcuts? What's one of the things that's happened in the so-called, in the age of social media is everything has to be rapid. Everything is like this 24/7. So we have to create news or put things out or whatever in a rapid way. So there isn't the time to do what we call slow media, which is, chew on something and write about it or draw about it or communicate about it after having chewed on it, after having understood it a little bit more deeply than just the superficial kind of thing that is happening with the media and communications these days. How do we get out of our own comfort zones and try and understand stories and enable stories from the margins to come out? Stories by Dalits, by Adivasis, by marginalized women, by children. And it's kind of, if we are privileged, to enable our privileges for that to actually happen. What kind of pressures can we put on the mainstream media also to be more responsible, to be more independent, and to support those parts of the mainstream media which have remained independent? So I think these are some of the sort of issues, and there's many challenges, of course, that are involved in this. The domination of the English media, for instance, is a huge challenge. And I've been very impressed by this youth network recently that's called Yugma, which, when it did its whole campaign against the environmental impact assessment notification 3-4 months back, they did it in some 15-16 languages. They basically got hold of dozens of young people from around the country to do their own language versions of the campaign messages. So if you take a look at that, you'll find Yugma is the name. Oops. think, I don't know, for some reason, a lot of slides I put in are not here. Anyway, so what we've been doing in the last few months is to also try and use different kinds of media channels, both the so-called conventional media and the new so-called social media, to try and put out a lot more of these sorts of messages, stories, films, um, memes, new word that I learned recently from my young friends, cartoons, and sound bites, etc., to try and communicate well beyond our own echo chambers. This is something that's, I think, our most important challenge, because what happens, especially in social media, is all of us get the messages that we want to get. And when we put something out, it goes to those who are already converted. So how do we kind of get out of those echo chambers and be able to communicate and have dialogues with people who might have different points of view from us, or who probably have never been exposed to the sorts of news and information and perspectives that we want to give out? That, I think, is probably our biggest challenge right now. So that's my email ID and some of the websites on which we have lots more stories and films and webinars and so on. So please take a look. I will share this presentation with Ram. So actually, I think I sent it earlier to Hamna. So please
Yes,
feel
sir,
free
we have
to,
it. Yeah.
yeah, please feel free to use it in whatever way you want and circulate it. And there is no copyright on the presentation. So I'm going to stop share now, and yeah, you can have your comments and discussion.